uh, and good afternoon, everybody. So today we are having another important session, uh, and on daily practice we come across many medical interventions, which may include maybe medical treatment or surgical treatment or some procedures, and we do it automatically, and when in doubt we don't know what to do, and in such situations actually all those what we do in our medical practice, it has some basis, and that basis is ethics. So using the principles of ethics, we can actually look into the moral aspect of our practice. So we will hear more about what are the ethical principles and how do we apply it in our practice, etc. from Rajagopal sir. So welcome, sir, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, Raju. Thank you, Arun. Uh, hello, everybody. Good to meet all of you again. Is everybody giving us a smile? Raju and Arun, even if you are smiling, I won't see you are wearing masks. I think there is a smile in your eye. Okay, thank you. Hey, so Fatima, thank you for the smile. Everybody, yes. I'm going to talk about me as a patient. At the last course, when I talked about me as a patient and what I would like done to me, one of the participants sent me a message, please don't do this. It's very difficult to hear you talking about your own death. Now that was said out of sheer affection. The person really cared for me and he could not think of me dying. But ladies and gentlemen, in palliative care, if you are to truly help someone who is dying, you have to accept your own mortality. With that introduction, I'll, though that particular doctor, if he knows about this, will be angry with me, I am still going to talk about myself as a patient. From 2019, every medical student has a new module in the MBBS curriculum that's called 8COM, Attitude, Ethics, and Communication. You and I, though two generations apart, had ethics being taught in forensic medicine. We did not see it really being applied in clinical practice. So this is something that is particularly important to us. And I'll start with this question. Suppose I have advanced cancer of the lung. Who will take treatment decisions on my behalf? If you are the treating doctor, should it be you? My wife and sons are with me. Should it be they? Who should be taking decisions? Will you respond on the chat box? Raju, will you read out any answers to me?
So we have answers like myself, together as a team. You, sir.
Okay, me, myself, yes. The team as a whole, okay.
Patients and relatives.
Patients and my family also, okay. Okay, there will be many more answers. Most of them are likely to be in this line. Whose life is it? It's my life, right? And you as a team, are you going to take decisions about my life? Okay. But you are making sense, absolute sense. I may be lying there totally helpless. I may tell you, I can't even think. You do the best thing, you are the doctor. Or I may say, ask them, ask my family. I don't know, I wouldn't know enough about my treatments. All your new hormone treatment and targeted therapy are unfamiliar to me. You, the oncologist, and others, and the palliative care person all together, will have to give me the advice. But if I am conscious, if I am in full possession of my faculties, you have to remember that this is my life. The fundamental overriding principle of medical ethics is autonomy. This is my body, this is my life. I have more right over this than any of you. You may have many degrees, but I have more right. Whatever you said is realistic. The team will have to assess me, decide on what is the best treatment for me. My family will have to get involved. It is their life also, but it is more my life than anybody else's. Ultimate decision, let us very clearly understand, should be me. It is the person's right, legally and ethically. Nobody else has more right. As a physician or as a human, as a medical healthcare provider, doctor or nurse or whoever it is, this is not my personal opinion. This is what is put down by Indian Council of Medical Research as the duty of care of the doctor. Doctor's duty of care is to mitigate sometimes suffering, to cure sometimes, relieve often, and to comfort always. And there exists no exceptions to this rule. So these two things I would like you to combine. Your duty is to relieve my suffering, also to cure me when cure is possible. Cure sometimes. Only 2/3 of all diseases can be cured. If not, relieve my misery as much as possible and comfort me always. This is the fundamental ethical responsibility that you have. This is defined by law in some countries. In India, the law doesn't define what's duty of care. In its absence, the decision of a statutory body, that's the Indian Council of Medical Research, holds right. Comments. I started by saying what the doctor's duty of care and what uh, whose responsibility it is to take decisions finally. Any comments? But use autonomy as a tool, not as a weapon. One of my relatives had gone to this specialist doctor and made the evaluation, scans, everything put together. The doctor looked at the scan report on the screen and said, "You have a choice. You can go through this course of treatment. One injection costs 45,000 rupees. It has less side effects, better chance of remission. Or you can have this medicine that costs only about 8,000 rupees for injection. You will need 5 sessions. What do you want?" When somebody gives you a choice like this, that is not really exercising autonomy. Autonomy has to be supported by adequate information. If somebody in the medical team had asked me, what are my finances like? I may say, okay, listen, I have this son, my son's insurance, which protects me for an amount of up to 5 lakhs for the treatment. That will be helpful. Adequate information to the treating team, adequate information for me. Suppose the person says, look, I know this costs only 8,000 rupees, but you see it costs a significant chance of neuropathic pain. I would recommend that if you can afford it, you should go for the other. Or the other way, give enough information, help me to make a choice. Autonomy is not to be exercised the way a waiter hands a menu to you and asks you to make a choice. And this actually happened to a friend of mine whom Sunil knows. Sunil, this was Sunshine Mugravi. She was being given these choices. So I told her on the phone, Sunshine, when the doctor gives you a choice, ask him, if you were the patient, what would you do? I will do the same thing. If I told the person, you have these choices, but I recommend that maybe you can go for the cheaper medicine because it is safe enough for you. Or if the person says, I think you should go for the more expensive medicine if you can afford it because it's so much better. That is weak paternalism. The choice is not the doctor. Choice is still being made by me, the patient. But a little bit of help is given. And I'll want that. If Sunil tomorrow, when it's my time, gives me all these choices, I say, Dr. Sunil, oh my God, I can't think straight. Please tell me what should I do? I trust you. Then I would like Sunil to say, if I were in your position, I would go for this. That is weak paternalism, not imposing decisions on me. You see, I have given the answer there. If I were in your position, I think I would. Help me to take that decision. But don't take the decision away from me. This patient was told, "Nunakku cancer aato," meaning, hey, you have cancer. You must have radiation. Come back on Wednesday. We'll start on Wednesday. No, come back for admission on Wednesday. We'll start on Thursday. She didn't go. She stayed at home. That is not quite ethical to tell her that and send her go, because she thought cancer radiation was burning your inside. The medicine would burn the internal structures, and the thought was terrifying for her. And she did not take the treatment. We had to explain to her what it all involved. Why her pain, we'll treat it for the time being, but if we do not have the radiation, it may worsen. And I think the bleeding will immediately stop if you have the radiation. And the only problems that you are likely to have are this and this and this. That again is weak paternalism. I said autonomy, it's her life. She says, I don't want radiation. We are not just going away, we are helping her. And that is proper exercising of autonomy. Any comments about autonomy? Are there any comments in the chat box?
No, sir, nothing yet.
Let me ask you now. Okay, now this is understood. If you were ill, what would you do? Would you like to take decisions for yourself, or would you want your family to take the decision, or would you want the doctor to take the decision?
So we have a chat from Dr. Geeta. She says that it is not easy in many situations, I suppose.
Dr. Geeta, that's a very valid point. If I say, okay, come for radiation on Wednesday, the person has made up her mind. Sharada went home. It is not easy. This is why this process should be made humane. Humanized treatment should be there. Every hospital, every oncology department, every place should have access to a social worker like we have. Even if the doctor is very busy, here, of course, Dr. Sonal will take 1 hour giving the explanations. But even if they were busy, there will be somebody to find out, hey, Sharad Chechi, you look afraid. What are you scared of? Find out. And then we'll say, I don't know what to do. Son, I don't know what to do. Okay, let us talk about it again tomorrow. Think about it. And if you want to ask me any questions, you can call me till 8 o'clock. You can call me. If not, we'll talk tomorrow. I'm not asking you to say, I'll be there 24 hours for you. That may not be feasible. Uh, so, this is a decision that we will have to make to give enough time to patients. I know cancer treatment is an urgent thing, but nothing is so urgent that it has to be on this point of time. The person is taking the most difficult decision. So thank you for Dr. Geeta. It is not easy. That's why we must help them, and that's why we must give them time to reconcile to the fact, think straight, and arrive at decisions.
Sir, there are more comments.
Yes.
The education of the family and patient is important. That's one comment. And the other one is autonomy plus weak paternalism from doctors. And if I was ill, sir, I believe even a lot of doctors prefer to fall upon their physician's thought process for decision making.
Yes. So the second one uh, is quite understandable. So I would do the same thing, Sunil. Sunil, what should I do? I don't know what to do. And I'm hoping on that weak paternalism from Sunil. But coming back to the educational status, Mahesh, let me tell you
Yes, sir.
something that I am totally convinced about. Education is not the same as intelligence. And Mahesh, sometimes I find that the educated, sophisticated city people find it much harder to take difficult decisions. That uneducated villager is much more used to taking decisions. The only difference is you will have to explain to him in words that he understands. The problem is in hospital, we say, uncle, you will need radiation. What does he know? What is radiation? We will also give you 3 cycles of chemotherapy. Cycles? You are going to give me 3 cycles? I can't ride on a cycle. We will have to talk in terms that he understands. And if we do, this, Dr. Mahesh, I am speaking from all these years of experience. I again and again and again find that people like us find it difficult to take decisions. They take brave decisions. They will say, Mahesh sir, thank you very much. I have lived my life. Just take away this pain. I don't want to do anything more. I am going. And then you will have to say, but uncle, let us talk about this one more. You go home and think. Let us talk about it again. And then he may come back and say, listen, I've lived 73 years. I've lived a good life. My family is important to me. I know I have some to go someday. If I do this treatment, my daughter will have to leave her job. My grandchild may drop out of school. I don't want to do that. I will go. Just give me comfort. And if he says that, Dr. Mahesh, I will respect that. The doctor in me will be wriggling, oh, if only he had gone through the treatment. But I have to understand it's his life and his family's life. I will still leave the door open. But, uncle, if you have more questions, do come back to me. I'll answer your questions. But I'll respect his decision. Yes, many Mahesh
Doctor,
or even biopsy is more difficult. Even biopsy they may not agree to. Maybe they are scared of something. I'll sit down and tell me, what is it that you're afraid of? When I said biopsy, you are afraid. I know of a doctor friend of mine who lived with a breast lump for a year and a half. She didn't even consult a doctor because she was afraid it may be cancer. She didn't want to face it. So that's true, Mahesh. Those decisions will be very difficult for many people. Okay, I must carry on, otherwise Raju will get very annoyed with me.
sir, Dr. Patna has raised hand.
Yes, please.
Dr. Patna, do you have anything?
Dr. Padma, can you?
Hello?
Yes,
I'm
sir.
sorry. That was by mistake. I think I'm trying to navigate the process. I'm
Okay,
so sorry.
okay. So we talked about autonomy, the person feeling his own right. But the other things are important. Beneficence. I have the duty to do good. I have the duty not to do anything that is harmful. I have to be fair. I have to be equitable. I have to look after distributive justice. All this is important. Suppose there's a conflict between autonomy and beneficence. Doctor, I know you tell me that chemotherapy will not help anymore, but I want to try. I want to try more. I am going to fight this disease. I want more chemotherapy. You know that judging by the last two cycles, the response is abysmal. You also know what has happened to the cell count. You know that if you give more, it's not likely to cause benefit, it's likely to cause harm. But the person says, I want it. What should we do? Doctors, be very clear. The patient has the autonomy, but you have your autonomy and your ethical right and wrong. No patient has the right to force you to do anything which you believe is wrong. No way. What I'll tell is, I hear what you are saying, but I really think it will be bad for you. And I'm sorry, I cannot consent to this. But I can refer you to another doctor of your choice. I'll happily tell the person, he will go to another person. I know somebody else may give him chemotherapy more. That's okay. But nobody can force you to do anything that you know is medically wrong, ethically wrong, or legally wrong. But talking about doing good and doing harm raises another point. Hello, doctors. Whatever you are doing, are you sure that you will do good always? Are you sure that you will not cause harm? You are giving a course of antibiotics, leave alone chemotherapy, course of antibiotics. Are you sure that it will do good? Oh God, It depends on that integrity of that laboratory and the culture you are basing it on. I am not sure that it will help. Are you sure it will not harm? Oh, how do I know? It can cause side effects. This does cause gastritis. I am giving this pantoprazole, but still it may cause harm. He may have such and such problems. And who knows? This may make him the organisms antibiotic resistant. So beneficence, as I said in the beginning, autonomy is the overriding principle, but it is not absolute. You cannot do anything that's harmful. You will consider what is good and what is bad. And here comes in the principle of double effect. You know that in any medical practice, whether you are giving paracetamol or morphine or chemotherapy, there are bound to be some adverse effects. But when the benefit far outweighs the disadvantages, we do it with good intention. That is ethically acceptable. Though we said beneficence and non-maleficence, when the benefit significantly overrides the untoward effects, that is ethically acceptable. That's all that is possible, because we are treating human beings. We are not repairing machines. So those four things that I mentioned are the official four fundamental principles of medical ethics. But there are also these unofficial principles that I would tell you, which I believe are very important and sometimes difficult core ethical obligations. One, compassion. Will you allow compassion to influence your treatment? Of course, we should. If you look at only the physical findings and the scan reports, I don't care whether the person can afford it or not. This is the treatment. You go and do it. If you don't do it, I don't care. That is horrible practice of medicine. That would be unethical, because the very fundamental principle, that's an interesting statement, something that I did not dare put in, was said by Paracelsus in 13th century. The most fundamental principle of medicine is, does anybody know what Paracelsus said? The most fundamental principle of medicine is love. The love that a human being would have for another. I truly believe that. I believe compassion is an essential part of any healthcare. We should try. Compassion brings on empathy. If I see that woman on that cot, I would say, my God, if I were in her position, lying in that wooden cot would be so painful. So I will not only think about the WHO ladder, not only me, nobody in our team, to a woman as sick as that, will leave them like this. We'll make sure that she gets a very good mattress to lie on. That's part of our palliative care. Compassion and empathy are essential parts of it. Empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy is, oh, you poor thing. That is irritating. Empathy is trying to put yourself in that person's shoes, knowing fully well that I cannot fully understand what she is going through, but trying to understand her point of view. The second point I'll mention is respect. Sorry for if I sound like somebody preaching something, but this is a rule not only in medicine, but in life. This is a rule that makes for better human relations. I know that out of the, how many people are here in this team? 40? Out of so many people, participating in this session. I know how many? 49. 49 people. Every one of the 49 is superior to me in some way. I don't know in what way, but I am sure you would have something in you that I do not have. So when Mahesh gave that comment, I don't know Mahesh, but I am dealing with this comment with respect because I am sure Mahesh has some quality that I do not have. I know that Raju, Arun, and Sunil have some qualities that I do not have. I may disagree with them on my issues. I may express my disagreements, but I will do it with some respect. And if I forget to show respect to a fellow human being, I will regret it later and I would not hesitate to say, I'm sorry. Raju, I shouldn't have shouted at you. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. I shouldn't hesitate to say that. And respect is to everybody, including children, your own children, your spouse, everybody. I believe everybody deserves your respect. And why I said this is important not only in palliative care is you try to think about it, practice it actively, and your human relations in this world will increase. The quantum of love and affection that you get will increase. This is not optional, this is our responsibility. And this is more difficult, being non judgmental. Being non judgmental means this may be a person who never lived a good life. You know, the alcoholic man who has always beaten up his wife, beaten up his children, never looked after his family, comes home and takes the money that she has earned, causing starvation for his children, and goes and spends it on alcohol. I would not be judgmental about him because I know that alcoholism is a disease. Alcoholism is a disease, just as opioid addiction is a disease that is based on genetic predisposition and influenced by psychosocial environmental factors. I know that if I had this genetic makeup and if I were the same environment and psychosocial environment that I grew in, I would not be different. What right do I have to sit on judgment of this person and say you are a bad person? Doctors, I will also remember one other thing. I will remember that because he was a man like this, he is not likely to get love and care from anyone in this world, including his wife and children. They may bring him to hospital, but inside they may be angry. I and you may be the only people who can still treat him as a human being with compassion. That's the privilege that I have as a doctor. That's the privilege that you have a doctor. And in many ways, this man deserves my care and love more than others. Because this is a man who has nobody else. If I also reject him, he has nobody else. This is not easy. Though I say all this, sometimes in my mind, I feel very angry to a man, especially for somebody who beat up children cruelly. I feel very angry. I can feel myself being judgmental inside. But I keep telling myself, Rajagopal, you are trying to be a judge. You should not be a judge. You are a human being. You have your own faults. Oh my God, I know I have my own faults, though I try not to show it. And I am not God Almighty, I am a human being. And my job is to give the best of care for him. And that's a privilege that is given to us as doctors. We doctors have that privilege that very few people in the world have. And we shouldn't abuse it by being judgmental. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we should remember to restore dignity to human beings. This woman has nothing, but she is still in her poverty living with dignity. Can she live with dignity in the hospital? When Sunil manages his palliative care unit, Sunil makes sure that our security staff, our cleaning staff, everybody understands palliative care. Because nobody should shout at the patients. You know that happens in hospitals. They start getting insulted from the time they enter the gate by the uniformed people, by the staff, overworked staff. That's sad. Dignity is offended not only by being insulted. At least she is covered by clothes now. What happens in hospitals? Oh, the big doctor is coming on rounds. Quickly, the clothes are torn off. That is maybe necessary. It may be necessary for you to examine her private parts. But that will be after you lock the door or close the curtain and instruct someone not to disturb us, and laying a hand on a hand and telling her, Didi, I have to take the clothes off. I have to examine you down there. That gives her dignity. She may have to expose herself, but her dignity is still preserved by the respect that you are going to give them for their privacy. Especially in busy government hospitals, these are forgotten, but that's where a little bit of thought from us will make a tremendous impact. I'll remind you of this duty of care from the ICMR. Your duty and mine, not only as palliative care doctors, as healthcare providers, is to mitigate suffering, to cure sometimes, relieve often, and to comfort always. And there exists no exception to this rule. Our focus, first, the well-being of the patient, secondly, of the family. But we cannot always do the thing. We will sometimes make mistakes. That's okay. We are also human beings. I will forget my theory and get angry with a patient. I will not be hesitant to apologize to that person. But even if you don't, it's okay. We will have to understand that we are not perfect and it's okay, and that we can be human. We will try to do our best. Raju, I have finished early enough for us to have some nice discussion now. Sunil?
So thank you, sir. I think here we can have more questions regarding the principles of ethics, and there will be many things which we see which we see or do in practice, and you can ask those. Yeah, I see there is one comment. Sir, what if there are a lack of information or literature to assist in helping patients make autonomous decisions? Provide paternalism or thinking of their good that is beneficial. These conflicts arose, especially during situations like COVID. Sometimes we regret after the patient is no more.
No, wait. Now I can read this. Let me answer Vinayak's question first. Vinayak asks, I'll repeat it, Sunil. What if there is a lack of information or literature to assist in helping patients make autonomous decisions, provide paternalism, or thinking of their good or beneficence? These conflicts arise especially during situations like COVID, all the time. Dr. Vinayak, you and I have to accept that we are only human beings. We cannot have studied all literature. Every day, new information is coming out. In 2010, we used diclofenac as a routine painkiller. Only in 2011, we saw a report. I saw it many months later, which said that diclofenac should not be given as a routine. Ibuprofen should be, because diclofenac causes COX-2 effect. I was doing something wrong for 8 months. Yes, that's okay, Rajagopal. You are a human being. None of us can be totally abreast with all medical information. What you and I can do is to do our best. Consult others when we can. There are a few people that I keep disturbing on the phone. There are oncologists, neurologists, everybody. I keep ringing them up. They may also not be perfect. There may be mistakes, but that's okay. This is the best we can do. I keep telling myself I cannot be perfect. I can only do my best. And in COVID situation, this is all the more. Okay, the COVID situation, your family's issues, your personal issues, and you are not even examining the patient properly with all the PPE. But this is what is physically possible for you. And in medicine, that's the best you can do because you are not repairing machines. Mahesh's question is, sometimes we regret after the patient is no more, feel like it would have been done in a different way. Mahesh, compassion is not only for others. You have to be compassionate to yourself also. Mahesh, it's okay. You have done your best. You have to keep telling yourself, Mahesh, you have done your best. We live with this all the time. From the time we were doing things by ourselves as house surgeons, we have lived with this all the time. If only I had not used this as an anesthetist, it was terrible. One of the worst experiences is somebody dying on the table. And then I keep hurting myself. If only you had not used, maybe you should have done that. And that doctor was saying, no, let us not use this. Why didn't I do it that way? That is a hazard, that is professional hazard that we have. We cannot be perfect. Most importantly, Dr. Mahesh and everybody, you need to be compassionate to yourself. Geeta says, I think it's a very difficult area, not something that is not much spoken about. Yes, especially some of the challenges, Geeta. But as I said, the students, your daughter or son entering medical school now will learn ethics more seriously. Ethics is going to be taken more systematically hereafter. It will take a whole generation for that change to happen. But it will take time. But ethics is difficult. And even now, we do not have perfect answers. Lata, I'll come back to you in a moment. Padma says, we are very harsh on ourselves. Yes, we shouldn't be. We should we should be compassionate to ourselves also. Lata wants to tell Sunil. We still have 15 minutes, right? Sunil, Lata is offering to quote an event, a situation, I suppose. Okay, Sunil and Raju?
Yes, sir.
Lata, please unmute
Yes.
and speak.
Yes, sir.
Lata,
Thank you,
where
sir.
are you from? Where are you from?
Sir, I am from Chennai, sir.
Uh-huh.
I work in Sri Ramachandra Institute with Dr. Julius Scott.
Okay.
He was the one who inspired me that I should go into the palliative care. So all these years, it was just under his guidance. Now I wanted to learn it more professionally. And he
Okay.
has always been telling me, you have to join the course. But since we couldn't take off, and this corona period has come as a blessing that wherever we are able to attend the class. Thanks a lot, sir, for this initiative.
Lata,
Yes, sir.
I love your Buddha statue. But would you
Thank-
show your face now?
Yes, sir.
Let us put a face to Lata's name. Oh,
Yes,
now
sir.
with the mask. Oh, off with the mask for just a second, please.
Okay, sir. I was in the ward, sorry.
Oh my God. You are in a COVID ward.
No, sir, but we handle pediatric oncology patients all the
Oh
time.
my God. Okay.
So-
Okay, Lata. So you are doing palliative care in Sri Ramachandra?
We don't have an official, sir, but we do practice with whatever thing that we can.
Okay.
So
We'll make it
actually-
official by next
Yes,
year,
sir.
right?
Yes, sir.
2021.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sir, we have actually had events where the child would have come with a very bad disease. We would have declared that the prognosis is very poor, and we allow the parent to take an option. They would have opted for palliative care, saying that we will go for native medicine because the cure rate is very less. But after few months, when the child becomes very worse, they come back to us saying that now I want to try everything, even if it is 1%, you give me medicines. We try to justify as much as possible, saying that it is going to do more harm, but they never leave us. They don't go anywhere. They say that we will never blame you. We can understand. We let us give that 1%. And then I can't say we are compelled, but we were not able to just send the patient away because they were very adamant, saying that we will take treatment only here, we will take only under you. But the thing is, once you start the intensive chemotherapy, the sufferings of the child, it really makes you feel so bad. It's not at all good to the child. And in between, the family now decides, okay, we don't want this, we are taking the child home. So we would have felt that I had done more suffering to this child. If only I had been more harsh in saying that, no, I'm not going to do the treatment for you. Would I have helped the child? Or I'm trying to take the guilt away from the family because the family says, I want to say that I tried everything possible for my child. Let it be 1% or 0.5%, which is right, sir.
So Lata,
Yes, sir.
one, first, to decide what is right. Second, how to convey that to the family. Here, according to what you said, the child cannot sit up and argue with you. The family can. And you know that they are possibly right. There could be an 1% chance. But there's a 99% chance that you will actually be harming the child more,
Very
making the
much,
child
sir.
suffer more.
Yes.
So let me try to help you to think about it. If who is your primary client, who are you treating? The child.
Yes, sir.
It is more about the child's life than anybody else's, right? The child doesn't have a voice, the parents have a voice. Legally, the parents are the decision makers. But ethically, your primary duty is to the child. Okay, there.
Yes, sir.
Granted,
Mm.
we fix it up. Rajagopal, who is your customer? Who are you treating? It is the child. You are thinking of obliging the family. And is that good for the child? No, it is not good for the child. Okay. Lata, it is not only a question of autonomy, What's your duty as a doctor? To do something potentially harmful?
No.
You shouldn't. Very clearly, in this case, you shouldn't be giving this chemotherapy. Now comes the next point. Whom are you treating? Not only the child, it's also the family. Think of the parents, the pain of the parents. It is not their fault. In our country, you say it's incurable. There are 17 others offering some other form of treatment. How would they know whom to trust? It is very rational and understandable that they went in for Ayurveda or miracle cure. That's okay. That is not their crime. They were misled and they are suffering. What I would do is to make them sit down. I'll tell Shanta and Sukumar, I see the pain in your face. I know you are suffering so much. I cannot even imagine the depth of your suffering. I acknowledge their suffering because I want not only to help the child but also the family. I'll promise you one thing, Shanta and Sukumar. I am mentioning two names particularly because by naming the person, we are acknowledging them more as individuals. I will promise you one thing, that I will do the best for your child. I know that you are in great pain and I'll sit there. Shanta will cry, Sukumar will cry. Sukumar will try not to cry because he's a man. Man is not supposed to cry. I know that Sukumar could well be suffering as much as Shanta or more. We don't know. I'll wait for a minute. This cannot be done in your busy clinic. If necessary, I'll ask them to wait. I'll get my lunch. My food is also looking after myself. I'll ask them to get lunch. Come back at 3 o'clock when I can find some half an hour for these three people. Then I'll tell them, I'll say this and wait. They'll cry for a minute. Almost invariably, they do this in less than a minute and say, I will not live if my child dies. I promise you, doctor, I'll kill myself. These things happen. You will lay a hand on a hand and then they will talk more. They will say how precious the child is to them. They will say how the child was clinging to them, crying, etc., etc. They'll maybe say many things about their life. And they will say, doctor, please save my child. Do anything. I can't give it. After listening to them, you will repeat, Shanta and Sukumar, I promise I will do the best for your child. Unfortunately, the best for your child is to take away the pain, any other suffering that the child has. Shanta and Sukumar, at this stage, I am convinced that giving them more chemotherapy is going to cause a lot of suffering. No, doctor, please, 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 don't say that, don't say that. And I would say, I'm sorry. I will wait till their bleeding goes on. I'll wait till they have finished speaking, then I will say, Sumar and Shanta, I want you to go back. Think about what you have said, what I have said. Think about it, come back on Tuesday. We'll talk more about it if you want. But I do think this chemotherapy will cause more suffering for the child than do. What kind of a doctor are you? You are giving up. You don't mind if my child dies? They may even get angry. You will wait till the anger has subsided. Shanta and Sukumar, I am trying to do the best for your child. I will continue to do the best for her. I can understand your anger, your sorrow, but I will do the best for your child. And if they say, no, no, I am going away, I don't, Chanda and Sumar, if you want, I can give a reference to another oncologist. Please go and consult somebody else. But whenever you give a referral like that, do always remember to do one thing. Don't close the door. Leave the door open. But Shanta and Sumar, at any point of time, if you want to come back to me, I'll be here. But I will not give that child chemotherapy. I will not give that child chemotherapy. I will not give chemotherapy to that child.
Yes, sir. Sir, in certain circumstances, the families have accepted. But in those cases where they don't accept, does it mean that it is failure on our part? We should have been more capable of stressing our point that it is only for the good of the child.
You don't, two things. One,
Yes, sir.
here in this context, what's happening? The mother cannot give up the child, the father cannot give up the child, they are doing it out of love. It is not, for one thing, it's not your fault. Secondly, Leda, compassion is not only for the child and the family, compassion should also be for you.
Yes, sir.
Here is a human being, and you have to tell yourself, Leda, you have done your best. You have done your best. That's all that you can do. You cannot be God Almighty. What they will do is go to another oncologist. You may even facilitate that. They may give another chemotherapy. Child may suffer more. That's not your fault. That's not the parent's fault. That's the way fate or the cancer behaves. And if they feel that doctor truly cared, then they will come back to you for palliative care.
Yes, sir. I got it right. Thanks, sir.
There was some other question. Thank you, Leda, for sharing that experience, which gave us an opportunity to bring up a very important point.
Thank you,
Hey,
sir.
Mahesh asked a question. Is there a course on compassion? Raju, do you have an echo program on compassion?
Not yet, sir.
But Mahesh, very important question. Can compassion be learned? Look, let me ask everybody, 49 people here. Is there any human being with zero compassion? Not likely. maybe some psychopathy may make some people go to that disease state. Ordinarily, everybody has some compassion in them. It is variable. Some people are very, very compassionate. Others are less so. And some people have been taught not to be compassionate. You all have been taught not to not to be compassionate in medical school. Oh, only 1 minute more. Okay, Raju, I'll be quick. We have been taught not to be compassionate, not by anybody teaching you not to be, by giving a class on it, by demonstrating it. You saw your teachers walk away from somebody crying out in pain, and you learned the untold lesson. It's okay not to be compassionate. You saw somebody, I did as a medical student. I am ashamed of this. I saw somebody starving and walked away without buying him a meal. And because everybody is doing that, I learned the lesson that it's okay not to be compassionate. But by demonstrating compassion, sorry, Mahesh, by demonstrating compassion, by allowing your natural compassion to come out, you are influencing a whole generation of people. Others will get permission to be compassionate. Mahesh, the risk is some people may laugh at you. Look at Mahesh, Mother Teresa, Father Teresa, they will say. Let a few people laugh. There will be some other people quietly seeing what you are doing. I wish as a medical student, I had the courage to go out and buy a meal for somebody who was starving. I didn't do that. And when I see somebody starving, I would not walk away without getting them a meal. By demonstrating that, others are getting the permission to be compassionate. I am not aware of a compassion course, Mahesh, but this is a course that you will do all through your life. By being compassionate, the course is on. Others are learning from you. Yes, Gita, every person has a seed of goodness in him or her, so also compassion. It's a question of degree. We give them permission to be compassionate. We demonstrate, we model the way, and compassion infects people around you. Thank you very much. I can see Raju getting restless because time is up. Okay, thank you.
So we can move on to patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Starlin Vijay. So Dr. Starlin Vijay, it's over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, everyone. I'm Dr. Starlin. Thank you, Rajagopal sir, for a very inspiring and insightful discussion. I'm a psychiatrist. I am working in Makonda Hospital in Assam, which is a unit of EHA. We have a cancer hospital nearby, so we refer most of our cancer patients there. So we don't have much of palliative um, work going on here, but so because of the topic today and one of the lesson objectives being discussion of futile treatment, I thought I would present this case which came to our general medicine, and then I was also involved in taking care of delirium in that case. So this case is of a 23-year-old lady with a final diagnosis of she expired and final diagnosis of postpartum eclampsia with probable intracranial hemorrhage. Because we are in a rural setup, we don't have a CT investigation nearby, so we couldn't do a CT scan. But we think it was a probable intracranial hemorrhage. Assam has a lot of maternal mortality rate, so we get to see patients like this a lot. So this was a 23-year-old lady who was a primi gravida, presented at term with intrauterine death and preeclampsia to the obstetrics department. They performed an emergency LSCS due to the arrest of descent. And 3 days after the surgery, she developed altered sensorium with GCS 5/15 and was shifted to high dependency unit. Um, and when we were doing that, we discussed the prognosis seriousness of the condition with the relatives. She attended ANC checkups near, reportedly she attended ANC checkups at her local primary health center. And for last 15 days, she had edema of pedal edema and abdominal pain since morning. She was 1 week away from her EDD. She presented 1 week before the EDD. She had no other problems during her pregnancy and no other general medical or neurological illnesses. When she was shifted to a high dependency unit, her BP was 120/70. Most of her BP recordings from the time she got admitted under obstetrics department were normal, except one occasion where it was 140/80, 140/90. Her pulse rate was 89 per minute. Respiratory system and cardiovascular system were normal. On CNS examination, her Glasgow Coma scale was E2, V2, and M4. Her planters were extensor, and Doll's eye response was present. She had mild papilledema. Pupils were equal and reacting to light. She was moving both upper limbs. Deep tendon reflexes were absent. She had pedal edema and she was afebrile. So we had a working diagnosis of hepatic encephalopathy, hepatorenal syndrome, with lot of differentials for causes, whether it was sepsis, whether it was part of eclampsia, whether it was an IC bleed. Next slide. Okay, so in the HDU, we electively intubated after consent from the relatives due to low sensorium. We gave mannitol and other anti-edema measures. Glucose monitoring was done, and antibiotics were also started. After 2 days in HDU, she started having continuous seizures, for which phenytoin and Magself was given, and they controlled the seizures. At presentation in obstetrics, her investigations were creatinine was 2.2, urine albumin was 3 plus, she had elevated liver enzymes, and HB was 6.4. Platelets were normal, her bleeding and clotting times were normal, CT brain was not done. Next slide. Psychosocial aspect, we couldn't, because it presented to the obstetric department, we couldn't explore much into the psychosocial aspects, but what we know is a young girl from a poor family. Later on, we wrote off her hospital bill. She was married for 5 years and her family was very religious. Next slide. So the main reason why I wanted to present this case was the ethical question and issue that we had regarding withdrawal of mechanical ventilation. So after 2 days in HDU, she had continuous seizures and later became comatose with absent Dulce reflex. Pupils were not reacting and was declared clinically brain dead. The poor prognosis was explained to the patient's relatives, and hospital protocol, what we do in such cases was, excuse me, waiting for another 2 days while someone is brain dead, and we withdraw the mechanical ventilation. If there is no improvement, we put forward we withdraw the mechanical ventilation if there is no improvement in the next 2 days, and this was put forward to the relatives and they agreed. When she didn't improve, relatives asked to wait for 1 more day as they wanted to bring a traditional spiritual healer for healing. So this was more like a last ditch effort from their side. So we allowed that traditional healer to perform prayers in the HTU. So ours is more like a mix of a casualty plus HTU kind of setup, where we thought it was okay to allow the traditional healer. When the relatives didn't see any further change, they agreed to withdraw the ventilation the next day. But before that, she had a cardiac arrest and early morning, and we did not resuscitate her, which was according to an earlier do not attempt resuscitation consent that we have taken from the relatives, and she expired. Now, in this case, next slide. So to summarize, a young lady from a poor family presented with preeclampsia with intrauterine death at term. 3 days after emergency LSCS, she had low sensorium, was intubated. She gradually worsened, developed continuous seizures, and eventually became clinically brain dead. The ethical issue was when and how to communicate and withdraw the mechanical ventilation, which was deemed as futile after a period of waiting due to the resource shortage. So we have a minimum of 6 to 10 admissions in HDU every day, and we have 2 ventilators. So we, in such a resource shortage in our rural setting, we kind of developed that policy of withdrawing ventilation after 2 days. And also the issue is about how to discuss the whole aspect of do not attempt resuscitation. Next slide. So I thought we can discuss about how, as doctors, when withdrawing some treatment would be very difficult from the doctors and nurses perspective. And there are also these pressures in low resource settings of using the ventilation for someone else. So how to manage that? On the other issue is when to start communicating the relatives of poor prognosis. In this particular case, because there was not much time as she was worsening and worsening in days, unlike a terminally ill patient with chronic illness. The third thing that I thought we can discuss was how to explain and prepare for do not attempt resuscitation or even do not attempt intubation. In this case, and also compare it with other cases where terminally ill people with chronic diseases also have doctors and nurses, they find making those decisions and taking the consent of do not resuscitation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Charlin. So these are very important issues which many of us will face during our career, and every day we'll face these issues. So all of you are practicing doctors, and many of you might have experience in this. So can any of you tell about how would we go about this? Anybody? It may not be specific to this, but if you have experience, you can also talk about that.
So maybe I think maybe when we see that there is a poor prognosis or the patient is already brain dead, then in the beginning onwards, if we feel it is a poor prognosis, we should be explaining to them that there is a chance that he may become brain dead, and in that scenario, we may have to withdraw her from the ventilator. And many of the people, they doesn't know what a ventilator do, what is exactly happening to the. If we could explain that to them early on, and at the scenario when we confirm a brain dead, it is better to withdraw them from the ventilator rather than stretching the resources of a setting.
Okay, thank you. Sir, I don't see any other comments.
No, but I am sure people would have comments. Hey, let me, Sunil, with your permission,
yes,
can
sir.
I start discussing the second question first from the audience? When should we communicate about the poor prognosis?
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Dr. Mahesh here.
Yes, Dr. Mahesh.
Actually, this is not the only one department. First, the patient came with the obs and gynae department. So I think the maternal mortality rate is high and pre-eclampsia is there. So every pre-eclampsia or high risk pregnancy should be communicate as early as possible whenever they came to this the labor room or to the obs and gynae department. But I think the obs and gynae department is the one department where the communication is very less. So I think psychiatrist or whatever the ICU person is there, they communicate as early as possible in the high risk pregnancy.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh.
Any more comments?
Dr. Manu?
Sir, in my opinion, the moment patients and the protocol that we follow in our ICUs is that whenever a patient is shifted to ICU, we do a complete prognosis charting. There are points given for specific things, and within the first 3 hours of an admission of a patient, like there are two different teams. One is like stabilizing the patient, and the other team, once the patient is stabilized, all the points, everything, the prognosis factors, everything, and the treatment options is taken into account and is explained in detail to the patient. Because since I work in a private hospital, so later on it can be a very difficult situation. We should, the moment a patient comes to ICU, we should be very clear about the way it is going to be, the cost, and how much they should expect. Rather, I would really appreciate if we are more on the on the safer side. if there's a 70% of chance of the patient doing well, we should explain only 65, because in ICU things can be very dicey. They change very rapidly, more so towards the worse in these kind of patients. Thank you.
That is,
Uh,
there are,
Sunil,
yes.
Muted, yes.
I am going to come back to some of my slides to answer this question. Raju, can you stop the screen sharing from your side so that I can do it?
Yes, sir, it is stopped. You can share it now.
I have some problem here to go back to my slides. Do you have my slides, Raju?
No, sir, I don't have it.
So, okay. Raju Gopal, you are not a computer genius. You are only a human being. You are liable to make mistakes. So I was being very compassionate to myself. I don't have screen sharing rights now, Raju. Please make me host again.
So you can share now.
Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. So here is an ethical issue that Dr. Stalin has brought out. Whose life is it? The patient's life. The patient doesn't have decision-making capacity now. She is unconscious. Whose right is it? The next of kin, the husband, other relatives, the husband primarily. So in this case, the answer to the question, when should you tell them? Let me try to answer. They have this is their life. They have the right to information. We have the ethical responsibility to give information to them. It is not a charity that we give them, it's their right. If you are not sure, suppose you are not sure, okay, will she respond? You have been giving her a barbiturate infusion or something. When she comes out of it, she may wake up. The thing to do will be to sit down with the family. Don't tell me you're too busy. If there was a tracheostomy to be done, you will find time, right? Those few minutes will have to be spent by somebody knowledgeable in the team, sitting down with the family. If you are not sure, say you are trying your best. She is still unconscious, but we'll have to wait and see in another day. We'll keep you informed. You are not overly reassuring. You are not saying everything is going to be okay. But then the husband says, doctor, please don't say that. Please say that she'll be okay. And what you say is, we will do the best for her. That's the first step. The next day, things are looking bad. You have another meeting, just 2 minutes. We are still trying our best. Things do not look very good, but we'll do our best. That has to happen periodically. It is not a favor that we are doing them, it is their right. And by doing that, we get trust. There may not always be trust for many people, especially nowadays in the last few years. People's trust on doctors is rock bottom. They may not trust you, but we have to be fair to ourselves. We have to do the right thing. We'll give them information. And eventually, here, we will have another session on end-of-life care. That particular, how we do this, etc., will be taken care of later. But the principle is still them. They have the right to information. We'll give them the information. If she is brain dead, legally, we can stop the ventilation, no doubt about it. But you also need to be compassionate. If you have not talked conveying this earlier, then you keep saying, well, we are hoping for the best, we are hoping for the best, we are hoping that she'll survive. One morning, all of a sudden, you say that she's brain dead. We will not be able to accept that. They must have done that. That doctor must have done some mistake. They naturally will be angry. You know, that is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross who said anger is the common response, the second response to bad news. That's only to be expected. So, Dr. Starlin, they have the right to information. We'll give them the information as early as possible. We'll do the best. The law says stop the ventilation. Give the family a little time to get used to the idea. At the same time, you have the principle of distributive justice. By keeping her on ventilator, you are denying ventilator to a young human being who can be salvaged. That's unfair. We put it all together. That doesn't mean that we'll stop it now. Suppose you go and tell them a young person can be saved, your wife cannot be saved, so we are stopping the ventilation. That's too brutal. So it is very important that the information will have to be given periodically and stepwise. I'm stopping sharing, Raju. Can you come back to those questions again? We still have 6 minutes more. Dr. Starlin, in this particular case, you do not need a DNR consultation. Patient is brain dead. If brain death has been diagnosed and documented, legally, you do not need anything more. You are safe legally. When the trick in withdrawing ventilation is to go slowly, give the information to properly. And as Dr. Starlin, I am sure you will have more questions. Please come out with any specific question we have, and I'll try the best to answer that question. Specifically about end-of-life care, the legality, how is it right? Can it be stopped, etc. We'll do more at the end-of-life care. I was more looking at the legal, ethical aspects. But Starlin, as Dr. Vinayak Jain says, your efforts and care are commendable. Congratulations. And only, as Gautam says, only because of brave doctors like this, many rural population are saved. And how to face this kind of situation is very difficult. So my pronouns to you, Starlin, and all your
Thank you.
Emmanuel Hospital Association does service in rural areas that nobody else provides. Please know that all of us in Palim India have enormous respect for the work that you are all doing.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Starlin, any specific question?
I think all are related to the end-of-life care, especially when we start some treatment and when we know that after a point it is futile. rural areas where we don't have equipments which can document brain dead in other senses technically. So we kind of have a emotional problem in trying to withdraw ventilation. It feels bad that you are stopping something which can keep the person alive a little more. So that those are some things we felt were difficult.
Not only that, Stalin, it's important also to discuss within the team, because a quiet person in the team, maybe a young doctor, a nurse, or an attendant, may feel that by stopping the ventilation, you are killing the patient.
Yeah.
And they will take leave for 2 days. On the 4th day, they could ring up a journalist and say that in this hospital, they are practicing euthanasia. It's very important that the ethical right and wrong and end-of-life care procedures must be discussed in the whole team, from the top to the bottom. There will be difference of opinion, but this discussion is vitally important because it will be reassuring to you also, because you are struggling with this thought. As an anesthetist and intensive care physician, one of the greatest difficulties that I had was this young mother's dying. There is another child, 2-year-old older child, who is going to be motherless. And it's very hard on us also. So we have to act as a team. Stalin alone shouldn't be the decision maker. End of life care and ethics have to be discussed in advance, early enough within the team, the right and wrong of it. For DNR, if it is brain dead, no DNR orders are necessary, but otherwise, it is after discussion within the team and with the family. Specifically for DNAR, very recently, the All India Institute has come out with guidelines. Raju, we'll remember to send everybody those guidelines for DNAR. But Stalin, if it is brain death, that's not necessary, but otherwise, we'll have to think about it.
Sure, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that information.
Sir, shall we wind up the session?
You are the boss.
Okay. So I think we will stop the session for today. So thank you, sir, for explaining the principles of ethics in detail and in simple words, and for being with us for another session. So thank you, and thank you all for your great participation in the topic as well as in the case presentation. Thank you all.